Hi, this is Christine, your relationship and mindset mastery doctor and leverage for change. Today I want to speak to you about and help you to understand how trauma affects the developing brain. So I'm going to speak to you from the perspective of a child, a baby just being born and coming up into an environment where there is a lot of trauma. Now, there are three areas of the brain that is impacted, in this with trauma. And the first one is the amygdala. We're going to speak about the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the frontal cortex, which is right here. Right now, the amygdala is usually referred to as the primitive or the reptilian brain. So that brain was one of the first parts of our brain to develop. That was when primitive brain, meaning that in those days when people had to run from, they had to have really huge sense of their environment. And so, and it's a fight or flight or freeze response that is usually engendered from this kind of any stimuli that may be in the environment that causes someone to be fearful for their life, that creates some kind of a stress. So this part of the brain, the primitive or the reptilian brain is what they call it, the amygdala, is responsible for the fight or the flight or the freeze. You'll see sometimes people, that is how people respond when there is danger, there's a sense of danger. They will either run, they will fight. I am the fighting one. I don't know what's up with that, but that's how I respond all the time. Or freeze. Somebody will just kind of freeze and can't move, right? In other words, it's the fear receptor. The amygdala is considered the fear receptor where fear is processed. So it's fully functioning at birth, guys. And the thing about it is that it starts its development in the 6th month of pregnancy. So imagine a child who is in the womb, still in the womb, fetus, and a lot of trauma and noise and quarrel and fighting, and there's stress, especially from the mom, because she's running for her life from somebody chasing her to kill her, or just the stress of trauma from continuous and constant arguments and stuff. That child is feeling it by their 6th month. They can feel that trauma in themselves, right? Because their amygdala is processing it at that age. The amygdala takes in the information to decide whether, it doesn't really decide. It takes in the information from its environment, through our senses. So our sight, or hearing, what we hear, what we smell, what we touch, and what we taste. Now, at the point of a 6th month of pregnancy, a fetus probably can just hear and maybe sense and feel and taste, because there's a lot of cortisol being generated then. The amygdala then is responsible for decoding emotions. The other important thing to note is that it's an unconscious response. It's an unconscious response. It's unconscious in its function, and so it responds automatically. So it's just something. It's a fight, flight, immediate thing to save you, because it's always the main responsibility. Is to protect you from harm. So it's going to act quickly without thinking, and so this is what the amygdala does. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that it happens from the child is 6 months, in the womb. From their 6th month going up, the amygdala begins development, and so they're able to sense the stress or trauma or whatever it is that is happening around them. Most people believe that because the baby is inside, they're not feeling anything. But believe me, guys, you have to be very careful, even when you're pregnant, that you have to be careful that your environment is safe, is not traumatic, because the child feels it. The unborn child feels it. The next part is that we are concerned about in this trauma, how trauma affects development, is the hippocampus. And this is more higher functioning than the amygdala, because it's more evolved and it can actually think, It allows you to think, reason, and to make decisions. It receives the messages. It receives all the messages from the amygdala of any kind of a threat, and in response, it secretes cortisol, which is a stress hormone, because it needs to kind of regulate that stress. So it secretes the cortisol to handle the stress. So it's responsible for cause and effect thinking. It's responsible for processing sets of stimuli to determine the appropriate response. When I say sets of stimuli, I mean it does not process stimuli, as like one stimuli. For example, you will see a ball, you'll see something, people running, right? And you'll think it's dangerous. Most people would run in the opposite direction, like run and follow the crowd, because obviously they're feeling that there's something they're running from, right? No, that's just processing one set of stimuli, because they're just seeing people running. But when they look around, or if they stop to ask someone, they'll say it might be somebody, maybe the group of people are running to go get some free food, or some movie star, somebody spot them further on, right? And so it's not a sense of threat. And so this is what I meant by it processes a set of stimuli. So, and because it determines the context of whether this is something that they should run from, fight, flight, or freeze, right? Because if it's dangerous, it has to be in context, within a certain context. So I hope you get that. Also, it's when the thing about the hippocampus is that when it is managing stress, especially when it is prolonged stress, for over a long period of time, continuous stress, there's always something going on. There's always arguments, there's fighting, there's cussing, there's just a lot of threat to the person, and they have this prolonged stress to the stimuli in their environment. What happens is that because it's so busy handling and secreting cortisol to mitigate this stress, and to kind of just mitigate it and regulate it so that people can remain sane, it goes offline. Right? And meaning it now cannot communicate with any other part of the brain. It just goes offline because it's just totally focused on being protective of the person, right? That it's secreting these hormones. I mean, that is handling, all these different stress. So it's secreting cortisol to mitigate that and to protect that person so they can handle whatever stress it is. Now, when there is prolonged periods of stress, guys, this is the problem, because what happens is that it inhibits development of the frontal cortex. So because it's busy, it's taking care of just surviving. It's in a survival mode all the time. So it's not the brain is not able to develop in the way that it should, in the time period that it should. So there is a lack of development in the frontal cortex, right? So now the orbital frontal cortex, which is the frontal cortex, is right here. It's the last, is one of the most recent developing parts of the brain. And its the primary responsibility is for executive functioning. So basically, it's the boss in terms of when your awareness, right? Because there's also a subconscious mind, which is a totally different thing, which I'll have to go into in another video. But the orbital frontal cortex, it is responsible for executive function. Therefore, it makes decisions. So when all this stress is coming at you, it's going to now decide how to react, right? Now, I did say in the amygdala, it's a fight, flight, or freeze. But then the hippocampus can now kind of look in context of that stimuli and actually see if it is within a context of fear, if they should act. But the orbital frontal cortex decides whether to act, if it should act, and how it should act. Should it fight? Should it go run and hide in a corner somewhere? Should it run, jump a couple fences over to hide from whatever danger it is. Whatever it is, the the orbital frontal cortex, makes that decision. It's an executive functioning. It makes that decision how to react, the response. And it also, what is good about this area of the brain, guys, it is the only part of the brain that can imagine. So it can go into the future and say, okay, if I do this, this is going to be the outcome. If I do that, that is going to be the outcome. So it determines how it's going to react by kind of like imagining what a certain response will end up, what the result will end up being. And so that's how it makes its decisions. So now this part of the brain develops between 6 and 12 months, just when the child should be able to start speaking and making sounds. And so if it's getting flooded with cortisol all the time, then this inhibits development of the brain. And it's some of the side effects are that the child or the person will not be able to complete tasks. They will have very short attention spans. They will not be able to have self-control. They just can't, they just don't know how to do it. And so these are children in a classroom that's always walking around and doing all kind of stuff. They can't settle down and be quiet and focus and do stuff, just focus on one thing for too long. They get very distracted and they tend not to be able to complete tasks. And they cannot follow a plan. They cannot reason. They cannot reason and imagine stuff, how things might be if you do this that way or that way. They're not very good at the critical thinking is almost not developed, and being strategic, making decisions. It's very difficult for them to do that as well. This part of the brain is also responsible for the emotional regulation, so self-control, the ability to decide, this is not worth it. Let me take some deep breaths to kind of calm myself and move forward. It's also responsible for attachment. So this also determines how the child or the person is attached to its caregivers or to anyone else in close proximity that is a regular part of their caregiving team. As I mentioned before, some of the side effects, some of the results of having a brain that is not properly developed or fully developed because of prolonged periods of stress is the inability to focus or concentrate, and they get triggered easily. Self-control is like almost non-existent, and they get angry and because they can't understand why it is that they can't do these things, and they really don't understand it. So guys, I hope that helps. So when you see somebody like that, you can understand that maybe it was because of previous developmental problems, because of prolonged stress in their early childhood, that may have been the problem. So I'll try to continue some more videos on this so you can understand how trauma in a child's environment or in any environment can affect someone. Have a great day. This is Christine, your relationship and mindset master doctor, your leverage for change. Take care. Bye.